The State and Work. Excerpted from Recognitions. Julius Evola. 1974. Narrated by Skeptical Waves. No orientation to the right is conceivable without taking a decided stand against the myth of work and of the worker, and against the aberrant culmination of this myth in latest times, which is constituted by the concept of the worker's state. It is needless to say that by right we mean, as always, the true right, not the economic and capitalistic right, which are the easy target for subversive forces, but rather the right defined by political, hierarchical, qualitative, aristocratic, and traditional values, custodian of the idea of the true state. Someone might object that such a right does not exist in the game of extant political forces in Italy, perhaps even in Europe. But even in the currents that are at least called national, the profound degradation inherent in the myth of the worker ought to be felt and ought to give rise to a natural reaction. Instead, too often, one indulges in equivocation which carries one inevitably to acquiescence to the vernacular and the ideology of the opposing side. But that is how matters stand today. To refrain from burning incense before the working class, to perceive that the quintessence of every non-retrograde and non-reactionary politics is servitude to that same working class and slavish obedience to its ever more impertinent demands, this seems indeed to surpass the modicum of physical and moral courage at the disposal of the better part of those who administer our politics today. Moreover, recently indulgence in the aforementioned ideologies appears even in the margin of nationalistic currents. The concept of the worker state, though embellished for the occasion with the added qualification nationalist, was lately proposed for study and discussion by the younger milieu. On another plane, this was introduced as symbolizing the revolutionary attitude, quite as if the presently reigning constitution did not begin with the solemn proclamation that Italy is a republic founded on work, for which it is clear that the asserted revolutionary demand can be understood only along the radical lines precisely of Marxism, socialism and communism, movements in which the myth of work and of the worker's state truly finds itself at home, not through a rejection of the system now in force, or of a revolution which might be reconstructive and restorative of the natural hierarchy of values and of dignities. Frankly speaking, it is almost tedious for us to revisit such matters. Our own stance dates back to the already distant year of 1934, when the first edition of our Revolt Against the Modern World was issued, and from then on we have never tired of denouncing ideologies of this kind. It is true that even in the fascist period, in certain syndicalist and pan-corporative circles, one glimpsed analogous tendencies, but these remained ever marginal and inoperative. Mussolini always refused to conceive of the fascist state as a mere workers' state. He affirmed the primacy of the political, he affirmed values higher than economic ones, he conceived of the very corporations that organized and disciplined the forces of labor and production as means, not ends. Nor did he, near the end of the fascist period, follow the distortion contained in Giovanni Gentile's formulation of so-called humanism of work with its backdrop of the meaning of history, all of which was interpreted precisely in the manner of leftist ideologies. By this view, after the emancipation of the human spirit which was celebrated in the Renaissance and in the humanism of that time, the liberal revolution represented a second conquest in the same direction, but its latest progress will be the humanism of work together with the ethic of work, that is, the recognition of the spirituality and dignity of work, etc., etc. The convergence of these ideas with the Marxist philosophy of history could not be clearer, and this Gentilian humanism paired off with the true humanism of Marx and Lenin, along with everything that one reads in the Soviet constitution about work, understood not as a duty imposed sadistically on everyone, but rather as an honor. On the other hand, one knows of all the tendencies toward an enlightened and no longer retrograde Catholicism which today hold to a similar line, by singing the praises of the ascent of the working class. The stages of human progress, according to the Catholic Maritain, are exactly the same as those conceived by Gentile. The culmination of history, for all such thinkers, is the civilization of work and the mysticism of the worker, this new subject of history, this new taboo and sacrosanct being, whom no one must dare to touch. It is needless to say that from the traditional point of view the stages of this presumed progress correspond rigorously with those of a gradual degradation and inversion, one which, moreover, has struck out also against ideals, values, predominant vocations, and, in general, against civilization itself. Indeed, it is obvious that passing from civilizations that gravitate toward spiritual and transcendent values to civilizations whose center is constituted wholly by the values, albeit the worthy values, belonging to a warrior aristocracy, and, from this, to a capitalistic and industrial civilization based on economy, material organization, and money and profit, and, at last, the final shift toward a society having for its center in its myth pure work and the worker, it is obvious that this process cannot be conceived otherwise than as a process of regression. The generalization of the meaning of the word work is characteristic of the final phase of this regression. It can signify only one thing: the tendency to conceive every activity under the sign of those inferior activities to which alone one can correctly apply the term work. It degrades all activities and brings them back to the same common denominator. This is what happens, for example, when one begins to speak of intellectual workers, of workers of muscle and mind, wherein is concealed the absurdity of a conception of society and a state based exclusively on work and on workers. Such an abuse must be denounced. It must be affirmed that work is work, and nothing more. It is nonsense to apply the term worker not to mention laborer to the inventor, to the artist-creator, to the thinker, to the warlord, to the diplomat, to the priest, to the scientist, even to the great organizer and captain of industry. The activity of all these men cannot be defined as work, nor can they be included in any way in the working class. Indeed, we would not even call worker the peasant, at least insofar as he is not some paid hand, but rather remains faithful to the earth and farms according to the tradition, and takes an interest in this which does not exhaust itself in the pure idea of proceeds. Today such a type of peasant, in conformity with social progress, is on the point of vanishing. It cannot be contested, however, that parallel to the above-mentioned abusive generalization of the word work, we have seen in recent times a degradation which in certain sectors confirms that generalization. Not a few activities which up until yesterday had quite another character are in fact now becoming work. For instance, one could well call work, in the more brutal sense of the term, certain forms of sports and of sportive training. Today the Catholics happily forget the fact that according to the biblical tradition, to which, on the other hand, they hold so strongly when protesting against birth control, work was conceived in strict connection with the fall of man and as a kind of atonement, thus as nothing which one can glorify. It is known that classical antiquity attributed a negative value to work in its proper and legitimate, meaning material, sense. Labor could be equated almost with suffering and with punishment, and the verb laborare signified to suffer. Laborare ex capit in Latin means, for example, to suffer a headache. Reciprocally, the term odium, in antithesis to labor and negodium, often was used by the classics to designate, not idleness but time dedicated to non-material, intellectual activities, to studies, to literature, to speculation and the like, while odium sacrum figured even in religious and ascetic terminology, and was associated with contemplative activity. Here we cannot resist the temptation of citing a Spanish proverb, el hombre que trabaja pierde un tiempo muy precioso, that is, the man who works, in the proper sense, loses most precious time. To lose this precious time, precious because it can be better used, might be a necessity, a sad necessity. But the fundamental point ought to be the refusal to make such necessity into a virtue, or to exalt a society in which this has become the keystone. In every sane and normal vision of life, work must be considered a simple means of sustenance in the case of beings who are not qualified to perform an activity of a higher kind. To work as an end in and of itself, and beyond that which is required for one's own sustenance, is an aberration, and precisely the worker ought to understand this. The work ethic, the humanism of work, work as honor, and all the rest of this blathering are naught but means of mystification, so as to better weld the chains that bind the worker to the mechanism of production, which has almost become an autonomous process. Already on another occasion we have cited this anecdote. In an Asian country, a European entrepreneur, having noted the scarce diligence of the natives in their work, decided to double their wages. The consequence was that the natives immediately began to work half as many hours as before, given that they now thereby earned as much as they needed. If the climate of social progress, of overreaching one's proper condition at all costs, of artificially multiplying one's needs, did not make such an attitude appear deprecable, precisely the prevalence of this attitude in normalized inferior social strata, and also in superior ones, would be one of the most efficacious means to stop the gigantic unleashing, that is the economy, the productive paroxysm which is becoming the destiny of civilized humanity. Returning a moment to classical antiquity, beyond odium in the sense here clarified, another term was held as antithesis to labor, opus, a work. Properly speaking, one applied labor to the slave alone, while the free men accomplished works, whence the Latin term opifex, which evidently in this connection cannot be translated by worker in the modern sense. Now, Spengler has indicated a most significant mutation when he observed that while modern man tends to labor even when he produces a work, that is, when he creates, acts, accomplishes, traditional man gave the higher character of work even to that which could be, in a certain sense, a job. Moreover, this qualitative character was maintained up until yesterday in the realm of traditional artisanship. The paradox is that in the exaltation of work and the tendency to reduce the state to a mere worker's state, work is ever more discredited. It has lost and has had to lose in exceedingly wide sectors its personal and qualitative character as a work, so far as to sink ever lower along the scale of activities worthy of a free man, which are exercised not for pure necessity or merely for the prospect of gain. In correlation to this, we have seen the degradation of the type of the worker who becomes a conscientious member of the working class, a seller of work organized in the trade unions, who thinks solely in terms of salary, of claims and of interest without any regard for the common good, without obeying any disinterested and noble motive, nor any values of fidelity, dedication, and intimate adhesion. It is even difficult to imagine that this might be yet possible, surrounded, as we are, by a senseless, mechanical, anodyne system. It is precisely on account of this base level of work and of the worker of today that one proclaims the workers' state and speaks of the social nation which is realized in the workers' state, that synthesis of the ideals of the new generation. In terms of its doctrine, it is obvious that the workers' state is the pure and simple negation of the traditional concept of the state. The regressive character of those developments which Marxist historiography wishes to present as progress is evident, if one considers the model which bit by bit has been chosen for the state. When, at the twilight of those civilizations based on spiritual and aristocratic values, effective power passed into the hands of the capitalistic and mercantile bourgeois, the foundation of the state was brought back precisely to the principles of that caste, which is to say, to the contract, contractualism, the social contract, a concept which naturally implicates material advantage and excludes every truly ethical factor and every organic nexus. Governing thus has become synonymous with managing, as in a business or a private administration, and it is not in the least surprising that in the United States one speaks, not of government, but of administration, the Eisenhower administration, the Kennedy administration. Then we descended lower yet, the model is no longer that of the company or the society created by contract, but rather even that of the socialized and rationalized factory. This is the level to which the concept of the workers' state ideally belongs. A sure guide for judging political forms is given by the conception of the hierarchy of various faculties in any man worthy of this name by the natural analogy existing between individual being and that grand organism which is the state. The entire extension, the quantitative development which material activities, work, production, economy might have in a certain type of civilization, should not impede the clear, constant recognition of their hierarchical place, corresponding precisely to that of the material functions of an individual organism, remaining ever at the service of a higher life. Only under this condition can a normal order exist. The true state incarnates those principles, those powers, those functions that in man correspond to the central and sovereign element, destined to give a higher meaning to life, to direct the purely naturalistic and physical sphere toward transcendent ends, experiences, and tensions. If one denies to the state the autonomy proper to a super-elevated power and authority, one negates its very essence, and nothing will remain of it but a caricature, something mechanistic, disanimate, opaque, superimposed on a collective existence which is itself no less empty. The primacy given politically to society, we have just indicated the analogy between such a concept and that of society in the commercial and business sense, is the first stage of this negation. The later phase is certainly that characterized by the workers' state, with the individual thought of merely as the worker-citizen. As we said, it takes as its model the factory under a socialized and collectivized regime. It is not necessary to say that the addition of the word national workers' state is but pure mendacious tinsel. Work in the modern sense has nothing of national character, it has no fatherland, stripped of its qualitative and technified particularities, it is everywhere the same, and peoples, races, and even genders bring about no true differences in it. But if with the epithet national one wished to indicate the nation as a superordered end, it is evident that one would have to commence by restoring a higher meaning to the concept of nation, one inseparable from the ideal of the true state, a meaning which naturally cannot come to the nation from the world of work, such a world being merely a means. For which the use of that hybrid formula national workers' state betrays unambiguously the incapacity to think in a clear manner, an incapacity which, moreover, succumbs consciously or unconsciously to the influence and the ideologies of the left and of the working class. As one sees, there is in any case an equivocation which leaves the door open to the adversary. One should finally have the courage to think all these problems through to the depths, without confusion, calling things by their right name. Let us therefore repeat that work is work, and nothing more. The working class is only an inferior part of the whole, today, qualitatively, more than ever for the reasons we have indicated. The incomparable proliferation which this idea has had in the world of today, given the present material type of our civilization, and the possibility of exercising subversive and often openly extortionary pressures, does not in any way change the subordinate meaning proper to it in a normal hierarchy. Neither work nor workers can have any place in the higher and most essential degrees of this hierarchy. If we wish to provide indications for useful reflection and discussion amongst that still healthy part of today's youth, it is on the basis of this view that we must provide them. There are already enough openings to the left elsewhere. One does not need to set oneself to competing also on the national front even if one's intent remains merely prophylactic, as is the asserted pretext in the unhappy adventure of the current center-left. The appeal to intellectual courage and to a true revolutionary spirit, more precisely, counter-revolutionary, because the true revolution today can only be a revolt against the political and ideological system ruled by the ideas here stigmatized. Such an appeal today is truly a categorical need.